Good morning and welcome to today's webinar. Thank you for joining us. Today we're going to be looking at later life issues, specifically the care options in the current environment, financing of care, government help that may be available, and also lasting power of attorneys. My name's Ange Crowley and I work in the marketing team here at Old Mill. I'm delighted to be joined today by three of our chartered financial planners, Andy Page, Carolyn Matravers, and Chris Tweedie, all of whom are also accredited Society of Later Life Advisors. So they specialise in giving advice to people with later life needs. This webinar is being recorded and will take the form of a question and answer type session. So if you have any questions, please feel free to pop them in the box by clicking on the Q&A little tab down at the bottom of your screen on Zoom. Okay, let's get started. Chris, how are you this morning?
Very well, thank you. And you, Ange?
Yeah, very good, thank you. Looking forward to hearing your views and expertise on some of the questions that we've got. Good morning, Carolyn.
Morning, Ange. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. How are you?
Yeah, I'm very well. Very excited to be part of this discussion today and have an opportunity to talk about some of these particular areas.
Fantastic. And Andy, how are you today?
I'm very good, Ange. Thank you very much. Yeah, very excited about taking part and looking forward to it. So, yeah, all good.
Good. So, the first area we're going to cover is around care options in the current environment. And Chris, I wondered if you would be able to give us a brief overview of the different care options that are available to people if they have a family member or friend who's getting to that stage where they need care.
Yes, certainly. It's quite a broad question, really, because there are different stages of care depending on the need of the individual. So I'll start by talking about care in somebody's own home to start with. It's referred to as domiciliary care. So the person stays at home, and it can be very low level care to start with. It might just be support and help that's needed with things like gardening, cleaning, maybe the shopping. And that is often supported by family, friends, neighbours. So there can be a support network of people that can help the individual in those situations. And if there are difficulties with meals, there are Meals on Wheels options. Some councils provide that still, but there are a lot of private companies that do that type of Meals on Wheels work. Alimento, Appetito, Oak House Foods, they are all available on a private basis, and they charge about the same as the government service anyway, so it's still paid for even if you have Meals on Wheels. So for very low level of care, staying at home, domiciliary care with informal support like that is a good starting point. If people have slightly higher needs than that though, and actually need somebody to come in and properly care for them, that's when you might need to bring in what is known as a care agency who provide domiciliary support. And that might mean bringing somebody in to help get the person up in the morning, or help them prepare a lunch, or help them go to bed at night, or prepare an evening meal and then go to bed. Again, it depends on the needs of the individual, but we're looking here at a supervisory function and a support function. It's not a nursing function where there is a medical requirement. That then requires a very different approach where you need a registered nurse or a GP to actually make medical interventions and decisions. So the very low level, as I say, care is domiciliary care. It's informal to start with, and care agencies can be brought in a bit later on. So that's home care. You can look at residential care and nursing care. They are much higher levels, and there is also a staging point between those that some people like to consider, which is sheltered accommodation, where you have an apartment perhaps, or it could even be a room in a housing block, but it's we'll call it an apartment for ease, where on hand there is support if you need it. You can have an emergency call button if perhaps you've got somebody who is slightly frail and there's a falling risk, and they might need to be able to press their buzzer if there's an emergency if they fall. But there's warden support on hand, and it does mean that the person can still live independently, But if something goes wrong, there's always somebody handy that can be there to call in on them and help where there's a need. So that's sheltered accommodation. As needs develop, home care may be an option still, but you've really got to then look at, are the needs of the individual going to be met adequately if they stay at home, or would a residential environment be better? And it really does depend on their needs. And residential homes fall into two main categories. We've got ordinary residential and dementia units. Dementia units are where people are usually in reasonably good health, but the dementia means that they have special needs that are different to somebody who still has all their mental faculties. And again, depending on what the needs are, it may be that a residential home is a safer place, because dementia patients tend to wander a lot, and there's a risk of them getting out. And if they are at home on their own and don't have 24-hour supervision, then there is a risk that they might leave the premises. And there are certain issues that you've got to be careful of if you leave people locked in a property on their own. Again, deprivation of liberty, safeguard issues, but also health and safety issues. So being at home and locking somebody in is not really an option. It's dangerous if they can't get out and there's a fire. So you've got to make sure that a proper needs assessment is done if possible. Unfortunately, local authority needs assessments are currently suspended under the Coronavirus Act. So it's a bit difficult to get those assessments done. But once you know what the best environment is for the individual, it may mean a move to a residential environment is better, because the individual gets better support. There's somebody on hand all the time to look after them. So residential care, is it more expensive? Well, it is compared to low-level domiciliary care, but it isn't if you are at home on your own and want one-to-one support and you have somebody in looking after you for 24 hours a day, because shift patterns mean that you can't have one carer doing that. You have to have more than one, and there are weekend rates and Sunday rates and bank holiday rates, so it can get expensive. And we'll be covering costs later, I believe.
Yes.
So if you do want to control costs, sometimes a residential environment where you have staffing ratios that can help can actually bring the cost of care down compared to being at home on your own with a full 24-hour care package. So a lot depends on what it is that's right for the individual, and the individual is the one that should choose. If they have the mental capacity to choose, they can decide where they're cared for. So, for example, they might not want to go into a residential home. The emotional attachment of staying in their own home, where they may have lived for decades, can be very strong. And most people, to be honest, I would say 80 to 90% of people say they would prefer to stay at home for as long as possible. But you may get to the point where the practicalities of living at home from a health and safety point of view and from a meeting needs point of view can't be met, and a residential environment then is really the best option. And it can be a wrench moving from home to a residential environment, but care homes do set up rooms in care homes where people can take their own possessions and pictures in to make it feel as much like home as it was before. So all of those things can help.
Thank you. Are there any specific, I know you mentioned around sheltered accommodation as an option. Are there any specific factors that people need to take into account in terms of pros and cons? I'm just thinking, if you go into a sheltered accommodation and then that isn't working for you, what are some of the considerations that people maybe need to take into account?
Well, any care placement can be deemed temporary, whether it's sheltered accommodation or whether it's moving into a residential care environment. You can always leave the option of the individual going home, depending on how ill they are. It depends on their needs. But yes, if somebody goes into sheltered accommodation and it doesn't work, you always have the option of moving that individual on, reassessing the situation and looking at alternatives. The benefits of sheltered accommodation are that you can live independently, but still have support on hand. So people still feel that they have their independence, and some people that's important. So if that is a key issue, then a sheltered environment can work. But it's very difficult to say, can somebody go in there and if they don't like it, just leave? Well, yes, but you need to find a reasonable alternative for them to go to if they do leave that environment. Because again, if they're vulnerable, then their needs must be met. Yeah. So it's really, you have to play each case on its merits. And yes, if the individual's not happy, the same as in a care home, they can always be moved if they're not happy where they are.
And have you seen, with the clients that you work with, have you seen any particular changes as a result of COVID-19, in terms of people wanting, availability in care homes, or moves towards more people looking at having live-in carers? Is there any factors of those at play?
Different care providers have different approaches. Some care homes have actually shut their doors to new entrants, because particularly where they've been hard hit by COVID-19, and in those cases they're trying to keep everything isolated, whilst other care homes still keep the doors open but have a quarantine period for any new entrants. So they will take people in if there are vacancies, but there is going to be isolation if they first enter it, and they want to make sure that those people coming in aren't bringing in the virus. So
is it now easier for family and friends to visit someone if they're in a care home? How's that working out?
It depends on the care home process that they have within each home. Some care homes will still not allow visitors.
Okay.
And one of my clients I spoke to yesterday, she still can't see her husband. She hasn't seen him now for 3.5 months. So it depends, whereas others do allow people to visit, but it's done with social isolation and other matters. I think Carolyn wants to come in here because she's got experience of that too.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that. I think Chris has obviously gone through all the different stages, and I think perhaps going through the pandemic and through the lockdown situation, it is very much thinking about those loved ones and trying to prepare possibly before those care needs arise, thinking about the other perhaps the ability to be able to communicate through an iPad or sort of Zoom, or and also perhaps having an Alexa, some company, that type of engagement with the virtual world through the support of family members, friends, etc., can then help. As Chris has said, at the moment it's not possible for all families to visit their loved ones. Some care homes, great, they've got outside spaces. Others, they're struggling to keep up a bit. So I think one key point that we have noticed with our clients is trying to encourage them to embrace and support them with technology, so that actually if we do go into another lockdown situation, everyone is a little bit more prepared, and it's not the scary unknown. It's actually sort of more planned, and you've got that ability to communicate with your wider family and friends.
Yeah. And it's amazing how many people do adopt technology regardless of their age, isn't it? I think we've all learned that over the last few months.
Absolutely.
Can I just add something to that?
Of course.
Alongside technology, for those clients and families that are not very familiar with it, there are other options. And I've had a client who actually lives 10-minute walk from her husband, who is in a care home, and she thought that actually communicating via Zoom or Skype or whatever else was going to be a bit disturbing for him. So she actually went old school and just sent him postcards every day. And he really reacted very well to that. So I think sometimes the old-fashioned communication can work very well as well. And it's also something more tangible that person can keep hold of and look at 3 or 4, 5, 10 times a day if they want to. So that's quite useful.
Yeah.
I'd agree, and I'd also,
as well as modern.
Yeah, I'd also just add to that. I think it is keeping those lines of communication. If your loved one or the individual is in a supported environment, residential or a care home, it's keeping those lines of communication open. And it might be that individual does not have the ability to actually cannot communicate through any virtual means, but that doesn't mean that it's not possible. You might be able to arrange to visit and wave through the window. I think the visual impact of seeing a familiar face, perhaps, I've spoken to clients where I've spoken outside on the phone and they have visually seen me. It actually helps with that connection, because we mustn't forget, for those elderly individuals, whether they're at home or whether they are in a supported environment, suddenly life has been very different. And we have lived through this pandemic, lived through the measures, but they perhaps have had far less experience or exposure to it, and their experience is perhaps people with wearing PPE. It can be scary. Some people might have come from a hospital to a care home, and so they're disorientated. So I think it's trying to think practically of any means of trying to bring a little bit of normality. As Andy said, you know, the cards going back sort of old school, it's just actually that normality that individual can relate to, and it, you know, it helps and can support on both sides.
Brilliant. Thanks, Carolyn. So, Andy, I know a big factor for some people is, you know, when you get to that stage where you need care, is understanding what the likely costs of some of that care may be. I wondered if you were able to just give us an overview of, I know it will be very different depending on, you know, which care home and what, you know, what facilities they provide, etc. But just from a sort of ballpark figure perspective, giving a little bit of an overview of some of the likely costs that people need to think about when care needs come up.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you said, it's quite difficult to quantify this because it is going to be very different on a case-by-case basis, and most care providers will do an assessment of that individual and work out what it's going to be. But if we go back to Chris's points about the different sort of stages that people would go through, so if you're looking at domiciliary care, so care at home, that tends to be priced on an hourly basis. And I'm going to quote lots of average rates here, but with the caveat that averages are horrible things in themselves anyway.
Yeah.
And it will vary. But on average, we're looking typically around about £20 an hour. So that's going to depend. That's going to change whether it's weekends. Sometimes evening rates are higher. Sometimes, you know, so weekends, evenings, bank holidays. Sometimes there's travel costs you need to add into that as well. So it's quite important when you're engaging with a domiciliary care provider to understand what the costs are going to be, what extras there might be, when that is going to change, and also when do they review those costs as well? Is it likely to go up every year? So that's domiciliary care. And then you move into the kind of the residential element. So ignoring sheltered accommodation, because that's just living at home, and sometimes you would have the bits of extra care that you would buy in on the same basis as domiciliary care. But if you're then looking at residential and nursing homes, as I said, horrible average figures here, but I did look up some figures for the Southwest, and that ranges from £700 a week on average for a frail older person through to £1,050 a week for dementia nursing care. Now those, as I said, are averages, and they include everybody who is funded by the local authority as well. So if you're looking at people that are self-funders, which we'll probably come on to that distinction in a bit, but if you're paying it for yourself, those rates tend to be significantly higher. And you know, we regularly deal with people that are paying in excess of £1,000 a week as a matter of course, and to a certain degree you do get what you pay for, but not always. So it's important to understand what the costs are for that particular home, and also make sure you're comparing like with like.
Thank you. And from a practical perspective, what would you suggest is the best way, whether it's for the family member or the elderly person themselves, to understand how they can best fund the care that they need? Because obviously, again, I guess that will vary quite a lot depending on what savings and investments people may have, but some of the options that are available to them to actually be able to fund that care as they need it.
Sure, and we could go on for hours talking about this, I'm sure, as we all do, but I think the important thing is the point I just made about understanding what the costs are, first of all. So you've got a clear picture of what that cost might be. Is then understanding what costs are you going to add on to that. So for instance, somebody going into a care home, what sort of personal expenses are they going to have? What sort of life do they want to have alongside what is provided by the care home? So is it a little bit for hairdressing, chiropody and a paper, or is it actually they're frail, but they still want to go out and they want to be able to continue to do that. So understanding that, looking at what assets and income they have themselves. So quite often we spend a lot of time helping families to get to grips with that. So, you know, the classic story of being presented with a carrier bag full of paperwork from that we found in mum's home. We don't know what any of it is, if any of it still exists. Can you make sense of this? Right the way through to people presenting a detailed spreadsheet of that. So I think that's a really good starting point to understand where you are yourselves, know what you've got and know what you've got coming in and know what you've got going out. So if you've still got a property, what expenses are going to be attached to that. And then when you've got that, it's then to look at what help and support you can get. So from the state, in terms of any state benefits that might be available that will help bridge that gap that normally exists in the vast majority of cases between income and costs. So whether it's attendance allowance, funded nursing care contributions, and things like that. So I don't know, probably now is a good time, if, as I've mentioned attendance allowance, to bring in our expert attendance allowance queen, Carolyn. Do you want to have a quick overview of attendance allowance, Carolyn?
Yeah, I mean, and I was just really going to sort of expand on exactly what you've said there, Andy, because I think knowing exactly your current position, we start from, well, what is, you know, you should be receiving the maximum income. And sometimes that is the individuals we're talking to, but also sometimes it is the representatives. So it could be the attorneys, and it can be difficult getting to grips with someone else's finances. And that's something that we can help and support with, because sometimes it's difficult enough getting to grips with your own finances, let alone suddenly having this bag full of paper. So often we will ask the question, are you or is your mother or father in receipt of attendance allowance? And there will quite often be a blank face, or, oh, I'm not quite sure. There can be, often attendance allowance and carers allowance can be mixed up. And often people can feel, well, mum gets attendance allowance for dad, or dad gets attendance allowance for mum. So just to explain, attendance allowance is actually one of the largest non-means tested benefits. So effectively what that means is it doesn't matter what assets you have. If you're a self-funding individual, you own your own property, if you fulfill the eligibility criteria, then you can apply for attendance allowance. And really going back to Chris's very first point, as far as the stages of care, attendance allowance doesn't mean you've got an immediate and obvious care need. It can simply mean that perhaps life's becoming a little bit of a struggle. You're not quite as nimble as you were, and perhaps you're not able to do the cleaning or the gardening or get up on those step ladders, or actually just, you know, if we all think back to how we were 20, 30 years ago, we don't jump out of bed quite the same way as we did, or we might feel that we're, able to do these energetic things, but actually we're not. So attendance allowance is the way in which some additional income can be generated. It is payable tax-free, and at the lower rate it's actually £59.70 a week, as I said, subject to fulfilling a certain criteria, and at the high rate it's £89.15. So from an income perspective, going back to Andy's point, when we're looking at what are your sources of income, so that could be pensions in payment, it could be investment income, it could be property income, and it could also be obviously basic state pension and attendance allowance. And if that's at the lower rate, then that is going to be just around about £3,000 a year. But if that's at the higher rate, that's £4,500 a year. And because it is individually assessed, as a couple, that could be at the higher rate £9,000. So you could find that you have some couples living at home, supporting one another. They do have the high level needs, but they're not actually necessarily receiving any regular care. they could also be eligible for the high rate of attendance allowance, which brings it back to why it is largely unclaimed. Because if you're living at home and actually you've adapted your lifestyle, whether individually or as a couple or with support from the family, you sort of think, well, actually, I don't know that I'm eligible. So part of the role and support that we provide is being able to visibly assess. And one of the other reasons that the application is largely unclaimed, it's because the form is incredibly long, and we are very much British, stiff upper lip. We'd rather say, I can cope. And it's not a question, absolutely not a question of saying, woe is me, look at how difficult life is. It's all about demonstrating, actually, you know, life is difficult. This is how I adapt. You know, perhaps, you know, I do have the support of the family. No, they don't watch over me day in, day out, but they are at the end of a phone. Or perhaps I do struggle with the finances, so I do enlist the help of the children or the neighbours to put the bins out, to help me complete forms. I'm not so good as I was on the phone. So it's all a case of us trying to help and support individuals to make sure that they're receiving everything to which they're entitled, which is really very much our starting point.
Are there any other allowances that people also need to be aware of that are available to them as well as the attendance allowance?
Sorry, yeah, Carolyn, carry on.
All I was going to say, Andy, I was just going to mention just briefly the carers allowance. So attendance allowance is an individual benefit assessed individually. And the point I would make there as well is that if the individual were to then be eligible for local authority funding or experience a period of hospitalisation, you have to notify the DWP, because you don't get both. You don't get both support at the same time. Carers allowance is available for individuals who are supporting someone. It is actually a low rate, £67.25 a week, and there are certain criteria. So carers allowance is a benefit that's available, but it largely depends on very low incomes, and so often you can find someone who perhaps is retired, so they're in receipt of their basic state pension. They care for their partner 24/7, but they don't fulfil the criteria for carers allowance because actually their sources of income exceed the threshold. So sorry, Andy, you were going to...
No, that's good.
Before we go to Andy, we've had a question from one of our attendees. I'm just asking Carolyn if you could give a couple of examples of the type of needs that somebody would have to be eligible for the attendance allowance.
Okay, and this is I'd say, I mean, it's become more challenging actually in lockdown, because visually we do, as a three, it's quite interesting, and we often have this conversation because I get involved with a lot of attendance allowance applications, whereas Chris and Andy, and we can't quite pinpoint whether it's a geographic location and whether Devon, Somerset sort of area, I don't know why, they tend to find people are in receipt of it. So what I would say is it's usually through a conversation. So for example, it might be, I'll give you a really good example of a client a couple of years ago. I said, I believe that you're eligible for attendance allowance. No, I'm not. So we go through some questions. What about, perhaps it's the ability to walk upstairs. So the conversation would go, do you go upstairs? I live in a bungalow. Right, okay, well, I noticed that there are some stairs coming into your bungalow, so a few stairs. Do you go up there? I don't come in that way. Right, so you go out, so you've got a ramp going out the other side of your property to take you to a lower level. Yes, so stairs aren't an issue. They're really not an issue in my life. So then I sometimes have to say, so when I did in this situation, say, so if you were faced with a flight of stairs, could you walk up them? Goodness, no, of course I couldn't walk up them. And this is where it's not a question of saying life is difficult. We all naturally adapt. So perhaps things are slower. And I think it's a really important point in lockdown. Individuals, we will have noticed those nearest and dearest to us, those that have adapted well, and those where perhaps going to, you know, doing their normal activities, perhaps going to the bridge, going to the day centre, all of those have been curtailed. So perhaps we're heightened, our senses are heightened to those that perhaps aren't as mobile as they were. People perhaps get a little bit forgetful and become a bit more reliant on family around them. I would really urge attendance allowance is designed to ensure people can fulfill and live an active life and remain in their own homes, and there is no stipulation of what attendance allowance is used for. So I might say to some clients, you can use it for a taxi, you can use it for a gardener, but you know, a really good example is one of my clients who we applied for high rate of attendance allowance, and very soon after he actually jumped off the Yeovil Hospital roof, and you know, that was supported by carers, but the point being he had a direct need, and he fulfilled the criteria, but that doesn't mean that he's still not living his life, he's still not travelling about. It's just more challenging than it would be for you or I.
A parachuting jump, presumably.
No, he what is it where you jump down the side of a building? Abseil. He abseiled.
Wow.
He actually that's an example. He has lived with Parkinson's for 25 years, and he was adamant that he wasn't entitled to something. So again, you can't assume that people have had these conversations. So it's really just worth a discussion to understand what's available, and it might not be available now, or you might not meet the criteria now, but that doesn't mean in 3 or 6 months' time that things might have changed.
Thank you. Coming back to the financing of care, Chris, I wondered if you could just cover briefly I know there are limits around what people have in their savings as to whether they can get government help for some of that care. Carolyn touched on it briefly, but what the current situation is on that and whether anything's changed in the current environment?
No change at all in terms of assessment levels. The upper capital threshold, above which you get no local authority support, is £23,250. So it's not a huge amount. If you live at home, the house is ignored. If you go into care and there's nobody living in the house who's eligible for it to be disregarded. So let's say you've got somebody who's got, say, £25,000 in savings and a house worth £300,000, and they go into care. If their spouse lives there, the house is still disregarded, and only the savings above that 23,250 will be assessed. So it could be that they would get local authority support very quickly. But if there's nobody else in the house, and they've got to be an eligible person remaining in the house, so it could be a disabled relative or somebody over 65 or a child, then the house will stay disregarded. Other than that, the house will come back into the equation. And with 300,000 going into their coffers or into the assessment calculation, then they won't get any help from the local authority until the assets drop below 23,250. And there's also a lower threshold of 14,250. So even if you have capital between 23,250 and 14,250, there is some extra income they add on to your other income called tariff income to factor in that you've got capital above £14,250. So you don't get much. You don't get to keep much yourself if you have a care need.
Okay. And Andy, I know some of the work that you do with clients looking at some of those means of financing care if it's going to be over the long term. And I know immediate needs annuity is one of the things that you sometimes work with, putting in place for clients. Could you give us just a brief overview of how the process for that works? And again, I know it is a big topic, but just touching on it as an option maybe for people where they don't, it may be the best way for them to structure their finances to meet those care needs over the longer term.
Yeah, sure. And it is just one of the many options we would look at for people. It doesn't work for everybody, but it's an option we would always investigate for people to make sure that the full range of possibilities have been looked at, and our aim is always to make sure that somebody, a family, will make an informed decision about how they're going to fund care, if they're having to fund it, if they're in that situation that Chris has mentioned with a house, usually that's the major asset, that suddenly that's been sold and they've got a load of cash. So to very briefly, an immediate needs annuity or care fees payment plan, they're called various different things, but in essence, it's the payment of a lump sum to a specialist insurance company in return for a guaranteed income for life. Now, the way that that process is done is there is an assessment of an individual's essentially life expectancy. So there's a whole load of medical information that's gathered on a form. There's questionnaires that go to the GP and to a care provider to gather all the evidence that is then carefully assessed by these specialist insurance companies to work out, well, what is it going to cost to actually provide that income for the remainder of that person's life. So that income is guaranteed for that life, whether it's a very short period of time or a very long time. I tend to refer to this option as the peace of mind option, because it's like pay that lump sum over on day one, and it's done. If you get that correct at the outset, then you don't need to worry about money running out at some point in the future, or having been forced into a cheaper or less suitable care home when you spent ages choosing the right one. So it's definitely one worth looking at. The unknown, of course, is how much that's going to cost, and that's an important factor. So that's why for everybody we would go through that process to look at that, so that you can say, well, actually that's an affordable premium to pay. Because the thing to remember is you pay that money over on day one, and whilst there are some capital protection options that you can build in and some way of getting some money back if death happens in the early months, generally speaking, it's a payment, it's not an investment. So you're essentially taking a gamble, if I can put it in those terms, about how long somebody is going to live and whether that's value for money. But it's not just about value for money, it's value for money, and more importantly, I think peace of mind. So we've ticked that box, it's sorted.
Thank you. And are there other options? I know sometimes there's often stuff in the paper about equity release on people's properties. Is that something that you talk to clients about as a possible option of funding their care? Yeah,
we would do, and equity release tends to work best for care at home. So whether that's to pay for domiciliary care, the sort of popping in a few times a day, or the 24-hour living care is probably where it kicks in more, because it's an ability to access the value of the property whilst retaining it. The problem with a loss of equity release, in the majority of cases, is as soon as somebody moves into a residential care setting, is then repayable. So it's an option that we would always consider. We would look at that and say, does that work for this particular person? And if it does, then we would investigate that a little bit further. The other thing to mention here is there is the local authority version of equity release called a deferred payment agreement, whereby if somebody has got assets outside of the property that are worth less than that 23,250 threshold that Chris mentioned, then the local authority can provide finance to pay for care and take a charge over the property in order to recoup that. But you do have to factor in, there is interest piling up on that. What happens if the property price falls over the time you're there, and the fact that you're still having to pay all the costs of running that property as well. So there are a lot of things to consider there, and we would talk all that through with people to make sure, again, that they're making an informed decision about what action they're going to take.
Thank you. Karen, did you have something briefly to add on that?
Briefly, I was just going to say, I think what is really key is that everyone's situation is so different. Care situations are so personal. So I think there's an awful lot on the television. You just, whenever you put it on, you hear about equity release, releasing money from your property, and just really the support and looking at those different options where the care is needed. Suddenly, having the discussions sooner rather than later is really the best advice that we can give, because it could be, things are slowing down, let's maximise income, or perhaps suddenly a care situation is changing. The options that Andy mentioned, we always encourage people really to have a discussion at the earliest opportunity, because however big your pot is, if you are paying £750, £1,000, £1,500 a week on care costs. It doesn't matter how big it is, you will start to hemorrhage money. So really, it's having those discussions early. We can't wave a magic wand, much as we'd love to, but forewarned is forearmed, and preparing you, making you aware so that you can make those conscious decisions in a timely manner as an individual to support an individual helps to explore the immediate needs, annuity, etc. that Andy mentioned, and consider if it's right for you in your situation.
Thank you. Chris, we've had a question just going back to the personal savings limits that you mentioned, that what happens if somebody's, when their funds drop below that limit, if they're in care, do they then just get funded by the government? Would they potentially have to move home if they were in a care home and it was a more expensive care home, then the government would need to be funded? Again, I know it's probably a big question.
It's a big question because it depends on who sourced the care in the first place. If the local authority were involved at outset and during the care assessment process found the care home for the individual and they assess them on that needs basis, the local authority are more likely to leave them there and pay for it. But if there's a shortfall going forward and it was something that the family sourced themselves, the local authority may say, well, there's only so much we'll pay towards care. And let's say the local authority, for example, say our rate that we're willing to pay for this care package is £600 a week. If you're in a care home that's at £1,000 a week, then there's a £400 a week shortfall. And they will ask the individual to turn to their family to make something called a third-party top-up. And the family may not be able to afford that. And then there's an awkward discussion about, will the care homes still keep the individual if they can't afford to pay the full amount? Because if the family can't support them, they may not be able to afford it. There's a problem. Yeah. So it really does depend on the circumstances, and it depends on what the policies and conditions are of the care home group that you're with, because they may say, if you've been here a certain amount of time and paid fees for a certain period, for example 2 years or 3 years, we will let you stay even if you become government funded and there's a shortfall. So care homes have to protect their own purse as well, because if they have too many people not paying their way, they can become financially unviable and it can cause them to close.
And at the moment, so from listening to what you said, it would seem that you're getting the local authority involved as part of making that decision to go into a care home might be a sensible thing to do. Is that something as a process that's still working at the moment in terms of the way the changes that happened around COVID?
The Coronavirus Act has enabled local authorities to suspend certain duties and responsibilities. The Care Act used to make it law that they had to provide a care assessment for an individual and a financial assessment subsequently to that. But because of the problems with the virus, it's actually allowed authorities to review whether or not they're going to provide services on the old basis of having to do it. And a lot of authorities have suspended care assessments because they don't have the resources to actually go out and do that, and the other factor is that they don't want to put employees at risk. So at the moment, care assessments have been suspended. And I think, Andrew, you said that when we were chatting about this a couple of days ago, that aren't all authorities now using the Coronavirus Act to support?
They have, yeah, they have the ability to. I think from a practical point of view, there aren't any that are really restricting anything at the moment, but the Act remains in force for up to 2 years. So it could, they could at any point, if the situation gets worse or if they're struggling with staff numbers, whether they're ill or isolating, that they can bring that back in. So it can. So I know some authorities were actually stopping some services, like day services that they were offering previously. They just completely stopped doing that. There's all sorts of things that can happen. So I think it's a fluid situation, and we have to be aware of what may be in place, and that this life is going to be a little bit more difficult getting all this sort of stuff arranged at the moment. And to go back to Carolyn's point all the way through this is, you know, the more you talk about it, the earlier you talk about it, the better, really, so you can be prepared and you've got time and you're not making crisis decisions.
Thank you. So Carolyn, I think one of the last areas we wanted to touch on in terms of questions that we've had, which are probably very key when you're people who are getting older, is around lasting powers of attorneys. And I wondered if you could just give us a brief overview to the question, why is it useful to have a lasting power of attorney in place?
I mean, what I would say on a general point, if you as an individual own a property with someone else, or have any you know, sort of assets or wealth, a lasting power of attorney is an essential document, because we often may think of a will in the event of something happening to us and we die, but actually in the event of either temporary or permanent incapacity, a lasting power of attorney is an essential document, and you can have that for property and financial affairs or health and welfare. Now, what I would say, because that it is a very long subject, and it may well be as a team you know, something that we'll run another session on this to explain that in more detail, but on a practical level, I can give you a real life example of lockdown, whereby if you don't have the correct paperwork in place, it can be really challenging. And people may well have heard of an enduring power of attorney, which was the old style document that was replaced by the lasting power of attorney. On a practical level, if the individuals you have appointed are not themselves able to make decisions or to support you, or in a position to do so, or you know, it makes managing your affairs very difficult. And I had a client who sadly was in hospital at the beginning of lockdown. She went straight into a nursing home, whereby obviously they were on lockdown. She had an enduring power of attorney, which often we have these discussions and people say, no, it's fine. I've got an enduring power of attorney. I did it years ago with my will. It's fine. On a practical level, it's unlikely to be fine, because it's dusting these documents off and making sure they are fit for purpose. And in this situation, her attorneys appointed under the enduring power of attorney were not able to act effectively for her, and really it's been very difficult and troublesome on a practical level for someone who is on their own, who doesn't have any children or immediate support, is relying on neighbours. And we all know of people, you know, you will have noticed people during lockdown, those that perhaps aren't supported by family as we perhaps are, those that are struggling more on a day-to-day basis. On a practical level, if suddenly you are hit by ill health, either permanently or temporarily, you've got to have those individuals appointed that you trust, and most importantly, that are equipped and able to make decisions on your behalf. So we very much talk about the importance of lasting powers of attorneys, but also involve and talk through those practical elements. It's dotting the I's and crossing the T's. It's having, as Andy said, having these discussions sooner rather than later. People will often say, oh, it's really awkward to raise the subject of lasting power of attorney. It sounds as though we're trying to make decisions on behalf of mum and dad. Absolutely not. It is a case of, mum and dad, you have built up assets, you've worked really hard. We now need to make sure that actually the right paperwork is in place so that we can carry on that baton, continue that legacy, and make sure that what you've built up is able to support you, and you are equipping those individuals to make those decisions with the assets that you've accumulated during your lifetime.
Yeah, I would just add, it's always worth getting that done at the earlier stage. I mean, at any age, because anything could happen. You can get, like my favourite things, you can get hit by a bus tomorrow, and be just physically or mentally unable to make decisions. And that document can sit in a drawer. It doesn't have to be used. It's just there ready to be used. And if you wait and you don't do it until the time it's needed, then you're left with trying to apply to the courts to get a deputyship order, which will, and I've got one going on at the moment, which is, I think we're 4 or 5 months in already, and it might be another 2 months yet before that gets agreed. And in the meantime, the family is struggling to try and pay care fees, all because the gentleman concerned point blank refused to do a power of attorney. He just wouldn't sign the document, and it's caused huge amounts of problems. But that's primarily because he was put under a lot of pressure to do it, to get it sorted, and he just kind of pulled his horns in and said, no, I'm not doing it because you want me to do it, and it's all done with a sense of urgency. So yeah, absolutely, do them as quickly as possible, get them done, and then yeah, it's done and ready to go when you need it. And you may never need it, but it's there.
I just really to reiterate that point, that it's worth its weight in gold if needed. And I think we are very passionate about the importance of these documents, because of course we get involved at varying degrees. We get involved where there isn't one. We get involved in Andy's situation, whereby, you know, we have to apply to the Court of Protection for a deputyship order. You know, we get involved at very different stages, so we really do understand. And if you are in any way thinking, oh, is this, you know, why would I need this document, do ring us, do have a chat, because we can give you numerous examples of why you need these documents, not just in later life, just in everyday life.
Thank you. That was all the questions that we had, and I know we're nearing 11 o'clock. So I think unless there are any final questions from any of the attendees, I'm going to share. So part of the reason we've recorded this webinar is that we will edit it and put sort of the key timings of when the questions were and when the answers, and that will then be available on our website. And to those attendees on the call today, or maybe some people who registered but were unable to attend, then we can share that with you if you'd like that. And I'm just going to also put up some contact details for Andy, Carolyn and Chris, that if there are any specific things that you haven't wanted to raise in the webinar today, you're very welcome to contact them individually, or you can also contact marketing@om.uk, and I or one of the marketing team will come back to you and put you in touch with one of our 3 lovely later life specialists, so that they can come back to you with any queries that you may have. So thank you very much, Chris, Andy and Carolyn, for sharing your expertise with us this morning. And also to those of you who've attended, for being on the call, and hopefully you found some of the information that the 3 have shared today useful for you. So I'll just leave those details up a minute or two. Carolyn, did you have something you wanted to
I was just going to add, I think really that the key point being that no question is a silly question, and so if there are any thoughts with regard to current care situations or the future, any one of the 3 of us, we're very happy to have those conversations. I think sometimes it's a peace of mind factor to know there is someone you can just talk it through, and a lot of the support we can give is actually moral support, because we are dealing with care situations on such a regular basis. Every situation is different, but there are common themes, so there are practical ways that we can help to support the individuals as well as the families. So please just don't hesitate in ringing one of us about that.
Yeah, we'll talk to anybody anytime, won't we?
Yeah.
Absolutely will, yes.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for everybody for joining us. Thanks again, Chris, Andy and Carolyn. And we will be doing more webinars over the coming months, so do look out for details of those as we share them, if there's other topics that you might be interested in joining us to hear about. Thank you very much.
Thank you.